The envelope with no name. The package arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of ordinary detail that made everything afterward feel more cruel. Callum Drevish had been in the middle of a shipping logistics call when his assistant set it on the corner of his desk. A plain manila envelope, no return address, his name written in clean block letters that belonged to no handwriting he recognized. He finished the call. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch he didn't drink. Then he opened it. 7 photographs slid out. They were printed on matte paper, slightly grainy, the kind that suggested a long-lens camera rather than a phone. Lyra was in all of them. She was sitting across from a man at a small coastal cafe, the kind with white-painted chairs and nets hanging on the walls. In the first 3 photographs they were simply talking, leaning close the way people do when the conversation costs them something. In the 4th, the man had reached across the table and Lyra had let him hold her hand. In the 5th she was crying. In the 6th his palm was against her cheek. In the 7th she had her arms around him and her face pressed against his shoulder, and she was holding on the way people hold on when they are terrified of letting go. Callum set the photographs down. He picked up the one where she was crying and looked at it for a long time. He knew the man. Not personally, but he had seen that face before. Years ago, when Lyra had still kept a small wooden box of childhood things on the closet shelf, before some quiet grief had made her move it somewhere he never found. There had been a photograph inside it, 2 teenagers standing on a dock, squinting into coastal sun, Lyra's hair wild and her smile huge, and beside her a boy with dark eyes who had his arm around her shoulder like he was responsible for keeping her upright. Callum had asked about him once. She had said, "That's Declan. We grew up together for a while." And something in the pause that followed had told him not to push. He hadn't pushed. He wished now that he had. He sat in his office until the light outside went grey and his scotch went warm and untouched. His mind moved through the photographs in a loop, generating explanations and discarding them, landing always in the same place, the same tight, airless certainty that the world he had constructed with Lyra, carefully, over 9 years, had a room in it he had never been shown. When he came home that evening, Lyra was in the kitchen, her hair pulled back, reading something on her tablet with a cup of tea going cold beside her. She looked up when she heard him and smiled, the real one, the one that still did something uncomfortable to his chest even after all this time. "You're late," she said, without accusation. "Long day," he said. He kissed her forehead. She leaned into it the way she always did, her hand briefly finding his forearm, a small automatic warmth. He stood there 1 breath longer than usual. Then he went upstairs to change and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, the photographs folded in his jacket pocket, pressing against his ribs like something trying to get out. He did not ask her. Not that night. He lay beside her and listened to her breathe and stared at the ceiling and told himself there was an explanation, and knew, the way a person knows a storm is coming before the clouds have formed, that he was about to find out how quickly love could become a question you were afraid to answer. What the tide keeps secret. 3 days passed before Callum did anything with the photographs. He told himself he was being rational. That a man who had built a shipping empire from a single inherited tugboat and 14 years of relentless work did not make decisions from his stomach. He watched Lyra across dinner tables and morning kitchens and the ordinary geography of their shared life, looking for something he could name, a flinch, an absence, some tremor in the frequency of her that would confirm what the photograph suggested. He found nothing, which made it worse. On the 4th day he called someone he had used twice before, a private investigator named Sol Juring, a quiet man who charged too much and delivered too accurately. Callum sent him the photographs without explanation and said, "I need to know who the man is and what they are to each other." Sol called back in 36 hours with a name: Declan Mosen. 34 years old. Marine researcher currently based out of a small coastal university 2 hours south of the city. No criminal record. No financial connection to Callum's company. No romantic history with Lyra on paper, but Sol had also pulled something else. Declan Mosen had been placed in the Mosen foster family at age 9, following the accidental drowning death of his father and the subsequent collapse of his mother. The family who took him in was the same family Lyra had grown up in after her own parents' early deaths. For 6 years Declan and Lyra had lived as siblings under the same roof before the foster arrangement ended and they separated into different lives. Sol delivered this information in the flat professional tone of someone who understood it changed everything. What Sol did not deliver, because he had not found it yet, or perhaps because someone had made sure he wouldn't, was any context for the meeting itself. Why Lyra had driven 2 hours to see a man she hadn't mentioned in years. What they had talked about for 3 hours in that white-chaired cafe. What she had been crying about. What had made her hold him the way you hold someone when words have stopped working. Callum sat with the partial truth and let it curdle. He told himself knowing Declan's name made him feel better. It didn't. It only sharpened the question. If Declan was simply a foster brother from childhood, why the secrecy? Why had Lyra never mentioned seeing him? Why the tears? Why the way her body had curved toward him in that 7th photograph, instinctive and unguarded, the way she used to curve toward Callum in the early years before success had built its quiet distance between them? What he didn't know was that Lyra had driven south on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks ago because Declan had sent her a letter, actual paper, actual handwriting, the kind of communication that told her immediately it was serious. The letter said only, "I found something. It concerns Callum's company. I need you to hear it before anyone else does." She had gone alone. She had told Callum she had a conservation board meeting in the city, which was partially true. The meeting existed, she simply hadn't attended it. Declan had met her with a folder 3 inches thick. Inside it were copies of offshore environmental operating permits tied to Callum's northern shipping expansion, a network of coastal routes and docking rights that had represented the largest growth in the company's history 4 years ago. The permits traced back through 3 shell companies and 2 jurisdictions to a single original land designation, fishing grounds and coastal territory that had belonged to a small maritime community decades ago. Declan's father's community. The territory had been absorbed through regulatory manipulation that bordered on fraud, passed through quiet legal channels until it emerged clean and buildable on the other side, and Callum's company had purchased it in good faith from people who had done the laundering long before he arrived. Declan had not been angry when he told her. That was what had broken Lyra open entirely, his lack of anger. He had been tired. The kind of tired that lived in a person's posture. He had said, "I'm not trying to take anything from him. I just need someone to know the truth. And you're the only person in his life I trust to understand what doing the right thing actually costs." Lyra had held him while he cried. Not because of anything romantic, not because of anything other than the fact that she had been 12 years old when his father drowned and she had sat with him then too, on a dock in the dark, saying nothing, just present. She had driven home with the folder hidden in the trunk under her field equipment. She had not told Callum. She had spent 6 weeks trying to figure out how. What she didn't know was that on the same Tuesday she had driven south, a junior executive in Callum's company named Petra Vane had flagged her vehicle leaving the city. Petra had her own reasons for watching Lyra, reasons that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with a quiet arrangement she had made with Nate Holloway, Callum's chief operations officer. A man who had been smiling at Callum for 7 years while constructing a patient architecture of replacement. Petra had hired the photographer. Petra had printed the photographs on matte paper with no explanation. Petra had addressed the envelope in block letters and left it with Callum's assistant on a Tuesday morning because she understood that the cleanest way to fracture something load-bearing was to apply pressure at the point where a person's certainty lived. Callum's certainty had always lived in Lyra, so that was where she pressed by the time Callum sat across from Lyra at dinner that Friday evening, watching her talk about a coral rehabilitation project with the animation that still, after 9 years, made him feel like he had somehow gotten away with something. By then, the second set of photographs had already been prepared. Nate delivered them personally, with an expression of exquisite discomfort, the following Monday morning. "I didn't want to bring this to you," Nate said, which was the truest lie he had ever told. Callum opened the second envelope alone. These photographs were different. Edited, though he had no way to know that yet. The distance between Lyra and Declan had been compressed. The comfort had been reframed. The grief on their faces had been cropped away, leaving only proximity, only touch, only the visual grammar of intimacy stripped of every word that would have explained it. Callum closed the envelope. He called Lyra and told her to be home by 7. His voice when he said it was very quiet, which was the thing that Lyra had learned over 9 years to be most afraid of, not his volume, but his stillness. The way Callum went silent when something had gone past the point where he trusted himself to speak. She said she would be home. She hung up and sat in her car in the conservation office parking lot and put her head against the steering wheel and understood that whatever she had been carefully preparing to say, she was going to have to say tonight instead, and that nothing she had rehearsed was going to be enough. To be continued in part 3. She held the storm for him. Communication discrepancy in a vendor contract, following a digital thread that should have terminated at a procurement server, when it led her instead to a secondary cloud storage account registered under a name that appeared in no employee directory. The account contained the original unedited image files from the cafe. She turned the laptop to show Callum. The originals were different in every way that mattered. The full frames, uncropped, showed what they actually were. Held the storm for him. She was already home when he arrived. That surprised him. Some part of him had expected her to be late, to give guilt an extra inch of room. Instead, Lyra was standing in the living room, still in her work jacket, her arms crossed not in defensiveness but in the particular way she held herself when she was cold or frightened, elbows tucked, hands gripping her own forearms. She had not poured a drink or turned on music or done any of the small domestic things she usually did to fill a room with warmth. She had simply waited. Callum set his bag down by the door. He did not take off his coat. He crossed the room and put the second envelope on the coffee table between them, and then he looked at her, and the look was the terrible kind, not rage, which she could have worked with, but devastation, which had no edges she could find to push against. "Tell me," he said, "what I'm supposed to think." Lyra looked at the envelope. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said quietly. "I don't want to sit down." "Callum." Her voice broke on the second syllable of his name, not dramatically, just cleanly, like a thread pulled past its limit. "Please sit down, because what I have to tell you is going to take a while and I need you to actually hear it." Something in her tone reached him. Saturday she talked for 40 minutes. She told him about Declan's letter arriving 6 weeks ago, written in the same careful handwriting she had recognized from homework assignments and birthday cards, and one note he had slipped under her door the night before he aged out of the foster system that said simply, "You'll be okay. You always figure it out." She told him about driving south and sitting across from a man who looked like the boy she had grown up beside, except older and more tired. She told him about the folder. She got up and retrieved it from the locked drawer in her study where it had been sitting for 6 weeks accumulating weight, and she set it on the coffee table beside the envelope. She told him about Declan's father. The fishing grounds. The regulatory manipulation. The shell companies that had cleaned the history of the land before it ever reached Callum's desk. She told him about the moment Declan had broken down in the cafe. Not slowly but all at once, the way a person collapses who has been holding something vertical through sheer will for too long, and how she had reached across the table and then come around it and held him because there was nothing else to do. Because she had been 12 years old on a dock beside a 9-year-old boy who had just lost his father, and some responses to grief are written so deep in a person that they precede thought entirely. "I was going to tell you," she said. "I was trying to figure out how." 6 weeks, Callum said. "I know, Lyra. 6 weeks, I know." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I was terrified. Not of you, of what it would do to you. Everything you built. The northern expansion was the thing you were most proud of. I kept thinking, one more week, I'll find the right words. And then I'd look at you at breakfast and I'd think, if I say this today I will watch something go out of his eyes that I don't know how to put back." Callum had gone very still. He was looking at the folder on the table between them, and Lyra watched him the way you watch someone process a damage assessment, methodically, the mind going quiet so the facts can organize themselves into something survivable. "The photographs," he said finally. "You know about them. I assumed there were some. When you called this afternoon She stopped. "I knew something had happened. Someone sent them to me. Twice. The second set is." He opened the envelope and slid the photographs out, and Lyra looked at them. Something moved across her face that Callum, even now, even in the middle of this, recognized as genuine shock. "That's not what that looked like," she said. "I know," Callum said, and he did know, looking at her face in this moment, in the actual room, the actual woman who had been beside him through every version of himself he had cycled through in 9 years, he knew. The knowing didn't fix everything, but it unmade the worst of it. The specific cold certainty that had been sitting in his chest since Tuesday, what replaced it was something almost worse. Not betrayal but grief. Grief for the 6 weeks she had spent alone with an impossible secret. Grief for the fact that someone in his orbit had looked at his marriage and seen a structural weakness to exploit. Grief, most sharply, for the speed with which he had believed the photographs, how quickly doubt had found purchase in him, as though it had been waiting just below the surface for permission. "Callum," Lyra said. Her voice had gone low and careful, the way it did when she was approaching something she wasn't sure would hold her weight. "I need to know, when you first saw those photographs, before you knew anything, what did you think?" He looked at her. "I thought I had lost you," he said. "And then I thought the worst. Not just about what you'd done. About what it meant about us." Lyra closed her eyes briefly. "That's the part that hurts most," she said. "Not that you doubted me. I understand doubt. It's that I know why doubt found room, because I've been somewhere else these last few months, trying to carry this thing by myself, and you noticed even if you didn't have words for it. I made space for it." They sat with that for a moment. It was Mara Elsin who broke the stillness, though she wasn't in the room. Callum's phone buzzed on the table and he glanced at it. A message from a number he recognized as a junior board member who had once quietly flagged a procurement irregularity that turned out to be real. Mara Elsin sent 3 sentences. I need to show you something about the photographs. I know where they came from. It's Nate. Callum read it twice. He looked up at Lyra. Stay here, he said, and the way he said it was different from the way he had said anything in the past 3 days. Not cold, not distant, but present, deliberate, the voice of a man who had just located the ground under his feet again. I'm not going anywhere, Lyra said, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she meant it without fear. To be continued in Part 4. The Foundation Cracks. Part 4. The Foundation Cracks. Mara Elsin was 29 years old and had been with the company for 3 years, long enough to understand its architecture and short enough not to have absorbed its loyalties. She met Callum the following morning in a cafe far from the office, the kind of neutral ground where a conversation like this one could happen without witnesses who reported to anyone with an agenda. She had a laptop and a flash drive and the careful expression of someone who had spent the night deciding how much courage they actually had and found it was enough. Barely she had found the original photographs by accident, or not quite accident. She had been auditing a grief-stricken man, an exhausted woman, the posture of siblings rather than lovers, the cafe interior bright and public around them. Someone had taken these photographs and run them through an editing process, cropping, color temperature adjustment, focal compression, designed specifically to make distance look like closeness and comfort look like desired. The account traced back to Petra Vane, whose name appeared in 2 shared access logs with Nate Holloway's corporate credentials. Callum sat with that information for a long moment. How sure are you? He said. Sure enough to come here, Mara said, which was its own kind of answer. Callum had known Nate Holloway for 7 years. They had celebrated the northern expansion together with a bottle of whiskey on a roof in a city that was raining. Nate had been at the hospital when Callum had a health scare 2 years ago, sitting in a waiting room chair with bad coffee and a crossword puzzle, not going anywhere. Callum had once described him to Lyra as the person he trusted most outside of her. He thought about that now. He thought about what it meant, not just the betrayal, but the patience of it. The years of calibration. The careful accumulation of access and trust specifically so that when the moment arrived, the damage would land in the most structurally significant place possible. He called Nate that afternoon and said, "Come to the office. Just us. I need to walk through some board projections." Nate arrived at 6. The building was largely empty. Callum had Mara's materials laid out on the conference table and he watched Nate's face cross the room and find them and go through several very rapid adjustments. Surprise, recovery, the brief flicker of something that might have been calculation before Nate settled on an expression of confusion so practiced it was almost convincing. "Callum," Nate said. "Sit down," Callum said. Nate Saturday. What followed was not dramatic. Callum had expected to feel rage, but instead he felt something colder and more clarifying, the particular emotional state of a person who has already done the grieving and arrived at the practical remainder. He walked Nate through the evidence with the same methodical precision he used in board presentations. The edited photographs, the storage account, the shared credentials, the timeline. The board proxy acquisition Nate had been quietly assembling over the previous 8 months, buying influence through intermediaries in anticipation of a leadership vacuum. Nate's story shifted 3 times before he abandoned it. The 4th version was something close to truth. He had built the company beside Callum but never owned any of it. He had watched Callum receive credit for things they had built together and swallowed it because the arrangement was comfortable and the compensation was good and the alternative was starting over. When the northern expansion valuation had made Callum's stake worth something extraordinary, Nate had felt something he called in that conference room, without apparent shame, a reasonable grievance. "A reasonable grievance," Callum repeated. "I didn't think it would go this far," Nate said. Petra escalated. "I told her the photographs were just pressure. I didn't know she'd send a second set." "You told her to take them." Nate said nothing. "You aimed it at Lyra," Callum said, and the flat quality of his voice was more frightening than volume would have been. "You had been in my house. You had dinner at my table. You knew exactly where to press." Nate looked at the table. To what happened next, legally, would take months to untangle. The proxy arrangements, the edited materials, Petra's contracts, the question of corporate misconduct. Callum had already called his attorney from the parking garage. The machinery of consequence was in motion, but there was something else he had to do first. He drove south the next morning without telling Lyra, following the same coastal route she had taken 6 weeks ago. Declan Mawson's university office was a small room overlooking a salt marsh, walls covered in maps and water data printouts, a coffee mug that said something scientific and self-deprecating. Declan looked up when Callum appeared in the doorway, and his expression went carefully neutral in the way of a person who has rehearsed several versions of this encounter. Callum said, "I'm not here to argue about the legal process. That's already in motion. I'm here because I want to say something to you directly." Declan waited. "What was done to your father's community was wrong," Callum said. "I didn't do it, but I benefited from it, and I should have had better questions about where those permits came from. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know, which isn't innocence, it's just a more comfortable version of complicity. I'm going to make it right. Not as a legal settlement. As an actual acknowledgement of what happened." Declan looked at him for a long time. "Lyra said you were worth trusting," he said finally. "She has better judgment than me," Callum said as something shifted in Declan's posture. "Not forgiveness exactly. That was a longer and more complicated process than a single conversation in a Saltmarsh office could contain. But the beginning of it. The willingness to believe the beginning was possible." Callum drove home in the late afternoon with the windows down, the coastal air cold and clean, the particular sensation of a person who has done something irreversible and good and is only starting to understand the shape of what comes next. What grows in the broken places? 3 weeks passed. The legal proceedings began quietly and then became less quiet. Petra Vane resigned before the board could formally act. Nate Holloway's proxy arrangements were unwound through a process that was expensive and exhausting and occasionally enraging, and Callum moved through all of it with the focused patience of someone who has chosen to do the right thing and has accepted that the right thing rarely arrives without cost. The Northern Territory matter was handled differently, not through courts but through a structured acknowledgement and a community restoration fund that Callum established with a portion of the expansion's original valuation. It was not enough to undo decades of displacement. He had sat with Declan long enough to understand that no financial gesture ever fully translates back into the thing that was taken. But Declan had said, on their third conversation, which happened over bad coffee in the same Saltmarsh office, "My father believed in people doing what they said they would do. That's all. Just that." Callum had written it down afterward so he wouldn't let the memory of it blur. At home, things were different. Not restored to what they had been before. Neither of them wanted that exactly, because what they had been before had contained, without their knowing it, the particular fragility of two people who had not yet been tested and therefore had not yet learned what they were actually made of. What was growing in its place was something rawer and more honest and, Lyra thought on quiet mornings watching Callum read with his coffee, considerably more beautiful. They had talked. Genuinely talked. The kind that happens at midnight and continues until it's almost light and covers territory that 9 years of comfortable love had allowed them to quietly avoid. They talked about the 6 weeks she had carried Declan's folder alone and why she hadn't come to him immediately and what that said about the implicit agreements they had built between themselves. The unspoken one that said Callum's work was fragile and should be protected from complication, which had been generous of Lyra and unfair to both of them. They talked about how quickly he had believed the photographs. That one was harder. "I'm not angry anymore," Lyra had said, sitting cross-legged on their bed at 2 in the morning with tea she wasn't drinking. "But I want to understand it. Because you know me. You've known me for 9 years. And some part of you looked at those photographs and thought, yes, this is plausible." Callum had sat with the honesty of that. "I think," he said slowly, "that when you love someone the way I love you, the fear doesn't decrease. It inverts. It becomes proportional. The more I have to lose, the faster doubt finds the door." He paused. "That's not an excuse. It's just what was true." Lyra had looked at him for a long time. "Then let me say this clearly," she said, "so you have it somewhere solid to stand on the next time doubt comes looking." She leaned forward and took his face in both her hands, and her hands were warm, her eyes were direct, and Callum felt something unknot in his chest that had been knotted since the first envelope. "There is no version of my life where I go looking for an exit from you. We are going to fight sometimes, and I'm going to carry things too long by myself sometimes because that's how I'm built, and you're going to go quiet when you should speak because that's how you're built. But I chose you on purpose. I choose you on purpose. Every morning." Callum had turned his face into her palm. He had not cried since he was very young, but something close to it moved through him in that moment, quiet and without shame. On a Friday evening 3 weeks after everything, Mara Elsin sent a message that the last of the proxy documents had been dissolved and the board had voted to acknowledge the Restoration Fund publicly. Callum read it at his desk and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for, not triumph, which was too clean, but something more like the relief of a structural repair, the satisfaction of load-bearing things holding after being rebuilt properly. He texted Lyra, "Come to the coast tonight. Just us. Bring nothing." She replied, "How far south?" "All the way," he wrote. "I found that cafe. The white chairs won." "Callum. The photographs were terrible," he wrote. "I want to replace them with better ones." They arrived at the coast as the sun was finishing. The cafe was closed at that hour, but the beach that ran beside it was open and empty, and the kind of cold that arrived in late autumn off the water. Not hostile, just honest, the kind of cold that made warmth feel like something you had earned. Lyra had worn his coat over her own jacket, and she walked with her shoes off, her feet on the dark wet sand, holding them in one hand. Callum walked beside her. For a while they said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The ocean was doing its large indifferent work, pulling back and returning, the sound of it filling the space that silence would have occupied. Lyra stopped walking. She turned to him, and the wind moved her hair across her face, and she let it, and in the grey-blue light of the coast at night she looked exactly like herself. Not polished, not composed, not performing anything for anyone. Just Lyra, exactly as she was, exactly as she had always been. Callum reached up and moved the hair from her face, slowly, his fingers trailing along her cheekbone. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "You've apologized." "Not the right one yet." He kept his hand at her jaw, her face tipped up toward his. "I owe you an apology for every minute I stood in my office with those photographs and let doubt do its work before I thought, wait. I know her. I actually know her." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, unhurried. "You are the most constant thing in my life, Lyra. And I treated you like a question." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not a question," she said. "You're the answer I kept finding every time I thought about walking away from everything and starting over. You were always the reason I didn't." He pulled her in then, not urgently but completely, his arms folding around her, her face against his throat, her body fitting against his the way it always had, the way that still felt, after 9 years, like something that had been made specifically rather than found accidentally. She pressed her hands flat against his back, and he felt her exhale, long, slow, the kind of breath a person releases when they have been holding it for longer than they realized. "I missed you," she said against his collar. "I was right here." "I know. That was the worst part." He pulled back just enough to look at her, and then he kissed her, unhurried, deep, the kind of kiss that wasn't asking a question or proving a point but simply existing, the way something does when it has survived being doubted and come through more certain than before. Her hands moved up his back and his moved into her hair, and the ocean kept going with its indifferent motion, and neither of them noticed or cared. When they finally stepped apart, her eyes were bright, and her expression was the kind that belongs only to moments like this, open, undone, completely present. "The cafe opens at 8, Callum said, very low. "That's hours away." "I know." She looked at him for a moment, reading him with the fluency of 9 years, and then she smiled, not the careful one she had been wearing for 6 weeks, but the real one, the one that had always done something to his chest. "The rental car has a heated back seat," she said. "Lyra." "I'm a practical woman, Callum." She was already laughing, pulling him by the hand back up the beach toward the parking lot, barefoot and easy and his, entirely his, as she had always been. "I studied the ocean for 12 years. I know when the tide is coming in." They walked together up the dark sand, the ocean enormous and unhurried behind them, the cold air filled with salt and the specific clean smell of things that had been washed thoroughly and left to begin again. Above them the coast sky was wide and dark and scattered with more stars than the city ever allowed, and Callum Drevish, who had built things his whole life and rarely let himself simply stand still inside them, looked up once before they reached the car. And then he looked back at Lyra. And he stopped building and simply had.